Berlin, March 4, 1944, just after dawn. Frost clung to the railings at Tempelhof as searchlight crews stamped their boots and the first warning tones rolled across the city. On the Seeberg plotting tables, green pips massed from the northwest, heavy formations, the measured heartbeat of B-17 flying fortresses driving east at altitude. Flak batteries along the Havel coughed black bursts into a pale winter sun. The air smelled of cordite and coal smoke, and the sky vibrated with layered thunder. Pilots of Jagdgeschwader 11 hurried to dispersals, expecting the familiar pattern. American bombers press deep, escorts fade near the Ruhr, the killing begins over the heartland. Yet as the scramble orders crackled and 109s and 190s clawed for height, a thin, silvery guard refused to peel away. Long-winged fighters, sleek P-51 Mustangs with Merlin engines and 75-gallon drop tanks shining like ice under their wings, held station beside the bombers, kept coming through cloud breaks and flak curtains, and were still there when Berlin's outer defenses came into view. A German officer later noted the disbelief on the RT. Unmöglich. The Mustang's endurance, pushing the effective escort radius beyond 1,000 miles, shredded assumptions formed over years of defense. Attacks on the stream met swift, high-speed counterblows. Contrails twisted into white ropes as 20mm shells and 50-caliber tracers crossed above the city's rail yards. By midday, columns of smoke marked hits near factories and marshalling points, and a colder realization settled on crews taxiing back under silent sirens. The Reich's capital lay within reach in daylight, and the old calculus was gone. The question whispered in ready. Rooms? How had the Americans built a fighter that could fight over Berlin? Leads us to the machine's unlikely origins and the choices that made its range possible. By late 1942, the promise of America's daylight precision bombing campaign was bleeding away over Europe. Every mission deeper than the Ruhr became a gamble measured in burned aluminum and lost crews. The 8th Air Force could send hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators across the Channel. But once their escorts turned home near Aachen, they were naked before the guns of the Luftwaffe. Jagdgeschwader groups waited like wolves at the edge of range, Walter Eusau's JG-1, Egon Mayer's JG-2, timing their climbs from bases near Bremen or Hanover to slash into the bomber streams. Over Schweinfurt in August 1943, 60 heavy bombers fell in a single day. 600 men vanished in smoke and twisted metal. The strategy of unescorted daylight bombing, so proudly championed in 1942, was collapsing under mathematics the Germans understood far too well. Each lost bomber meant 10 trained men and months of production erased before noon. In Washington, General Henry Hap Arnold raged that the bombers must have a fighter that can go all the way. Engineers had tried. The massive P-47 Thunderbolt could fight but drank fuel like a flying furnace. The twin-boom P-38 Lightning had range yet struggled in European winters, its turbochargers choking on cold, damp air. Something lighter, sleeker, and more efficient was needed. An aircraft that could match a bomber's endurance without sacrificing speed. Across the Atlantic, the seed already existed. In 1940, the British Purchasing Commission had asked North American Aviation to build licensed P-40s. Instead, the company offered to design a new fighter from scratch, the NA-73X. Its lines were clean and radical, laminar-flow wings that sliced drag, an internal fuel system balanced around efficiency, a low-drag radiator scoop that created thrust instead of resistance. Yet the early Allison engine gasped above 15,000 feet, leaving the aircraft brilliant in theory but weak in European skies. Then the British married it with the Rolls-Royce Merlin, whose two-stage supercharger transformed altitude into advantage. The hybrid was tested, refined, and reborn as the P-51 Mustang, an American airframe carrying a British heart. It was born not from triumph, but from desperation. Forged in cooperation rather than pride. Soon, that combination of reach and firepower would answer Arnold's demand and carry U.S. bombers beyond the limits that had doomed so many before. The next chapter in air warfare, the one that would end the Luftwaffe's reign, was ready to take flight. In the closing months of 1942, two great industrial traditions, American mass production and British engineering finesse, met in an alliance that would alter the balance of air power. The original Mustang, the British-designated MKIA powered by the Allison V1710 engine, had shown flashes of brilliance, superb agility at low altitude, unmatched stability in a dive, and a range that hinted at strategic promise. Yet above 15,000 feet, where the great air battles of Europe were being fought, its engine faltered. Turbo supercharging, the key to high-altitude performance, was beyond the Allison's limits. To the British engineers at Rolls-Royce's experimental station in Hucknall, Nottinghamshire, the answer was simple and radical: replace the heart. They fitted a Merlin 61 engine, the same power plant that had lifted the Spitfire Mk9 to glory, and married it to the Mustang's efficient airframe. The first flight in October 1942 left test pilots stunned. The once modest Mustang now tore through the clouds at 440 miles per hour at 30,000 feet, climbing like a Spitfire yet flying nearly twice as far. The laminar-flow wings, so misunderstood in earlier trials, now revealed their genius, slicing air cleanly, reducing drag at speeds that would have torn older designs apart. American observers quickly realized what they were seeing: the future. Orders for production roared through the channels of the U.S. Army Air Forces, and North American Aviation's plants at Inglewood, California, and Dallas, Texas, began retooling to mass-produce what would become the P-51B and C models. Each carried the Merlin-powered soul that Britain had proven, but wrapped in American precision: a top speed near 440 mph, a service ceiling over 40,000 feet, and 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns in its wings. Engineers fitted an 85-gallon fuselage tank and designed drop tanks of 75 and 108 gallons each, pushing its combat radius beyond 750 miles and its total range over 1,500. It could now fly from English fields, meet bombers over Germany, fight all the way to Berlin, and return. By late 1943, the first squadrons, among them the 354th Fighter Group, received their Mustangs in England. Pilots, many hardened by Thunderbolt and Lightning missions, called it the Cadillac of the sky. It turned tighter, dove faster, and climbed smoother than anything they had flown. To the Luftwaffe, already bleeding pilots over the Eastern Front and Italy, the P-51's arrival seemed at first a rumor. But that rumor would soon manifest in contrails high above the Reich, heralding a new kind of war, one that would carry the fight to their own doorstep. December 1943. The skies over northern Germany were iron gray and bitterly cold, the kind of winter air that made aluminum groan and engines roar sharper. At 20,000 feet, vapor trails stretched eastward from the bomber columns, hundreds of B-17s bound for Bremen's docks and aircraft plants. Flying just ahead, in formation tighter and sleeker than anyone expected, were fighters no German observer could yet name with certainty. Their wings were long, their fuselages slender, and their contrails stayed with the bombers all the way from the North Sea. These were the P-51Bs of the 354th Fighter Group, the Mustang's combat debut. Over the Weser River, radar screens lit up across Luftwaffe command posts, and scramble orders echoed through hangars at Jever and Wittmundhafen. Jagdgeschwader 1 and JG-11 climbed to intercept, expecting the same pattern as always: brief contact with thunderbolts that would vanish westward before the decisive altitude. But when the German Focke-Wulf FW-190s reached 25,000 feet, the newcomers did not turn back. They came higher, faster, with silver flashes under their wings that resolved into 650 caliber muzzles spitting fire. Captain James H. Howard and his men cut across the formation with discipline born of weeks of anticipation. Within minutes, contrails broke into spirals of smoke as the first FW-190s went down in flames. The Mustangs, astonishingly, pressed on eastward rather than retreating. For the Germans, disbelief spread faster than the combat reports. One pilot of JG-11 later recalled, "They stayed with the bombers longer than any Amerikaner Jäger before. Impossible range." The Oberkommando der Luftwaffe's intelligence summary for December recorded the unsettling note, "Neue Jäger mit ungewöhnlicher Reichweite. New fighter with unusual range." In subsequent raids to Kiel and Hanover through January 1944, those same aircraft reappeared, escorting the bombers to their targets and fighting all the way home. For the first time in the European air war, the unthinkable happened. Entire bomber groups returned with barely a handful of losses. The crews, long haunted by flaming wrecks over Germany, coined a term whispered with gratitude, "little friends." From that winter onward, the Luftwaffe's hunting grounds were shrinking. The next missions would push beyond Bremen's frozen fields, deeper into the heart of the Reich, toward a capital that still believed itself untouchable. March 4th, 1944, Berlin, the heart of the Reich. The morning broke cold and brilliant, sunlight glinting from the frozen spree as air raid sirens wailed across the city. On the horizon, faint silver specks appeared, growing into vast formations, nearly 800 bombers of the U.S. 8th Air Force. It was the first full-scale raid against the German capital. To Berliners below, it looked as if the entire western sky had come alive with wings. Only weeks earlier, Operation Argument, Big Week, had crippled Germany's aircraft industry, hammering factories at Regensburg, Augsburg, and Gotha. Yet the Luftwaffe still believed the capital itself lay beyond sustained attack. That illusion was about to vanish in the roar of Merlin engines. German radar stations near Münster first caught the incoming stream mid-morning. Analysts at Luftflotte Reich assumed it was another deep strike that would lose Escort near the Rhine. But as squadrons of FW-190s and Bf-109s scrambled from JG-11, JG-26, and JG-54, something was wrong with the pattern. The Escort didn't turn back. Over Magdeburg, the shimmering dots stayed with the bombers, their long wings unmistakable even through contrail haze. By the time the formations reached Berlin's outskirts, the defenders were astonished. The American P-51 Mustangs were still there. At 25,000 feet above the capital, the first dogfights erupted. Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke of JG-11 later wrote, "They stayed with the bombers over Berlin itself. I could scarcely believe it. Mustangs dove through German formations with the precision of predators, slashing at interceptors before they could line up their attacks." Below, Berliners looked up through drifting smoke and saw, for the first time, American fighters circling freely above their city. The myth of the untouchable homeland dissolved that day. By sunset, the Luftwaffe had lost more than 60 aircraft. American losses were a fraction. For Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry, even words faltered. How could they explain enemy fighters now ruling the skies of the Reich's capital? That afternoon, the P-51 Mustang proved it could go anywhere, fight anyone, and return unchallenged. The war in the air had turned irreversibly. As the victorious squadrons crossed the Channel homeward, contrails fading into dusk, Europe's skies and the outcome of the war itself belonged to the Mustang. In the weeks following the March 1944 raids, panic rippled through the Luftwaffe's intelligence network. Nothing in their manuals accounted for what they had seen. American single-engine fighters fighting above Berlin and escorting bombers home. At first, the reports contradicted one another. Some claimed the mysterious aircraft was a Spitfire variant operating from secret forward bases. Others swore it had twin engines hidden in its fuselage. Field observers noted its long wings and clean lines but could not agree on its origin. Within the technical office of the Luftwaffe, engineers pored over gun camera film and fragments retrieved from wreckage, trying to decode the intruder's secret. By April 1944, the mystery was formally logged as North American P-51. Analysts correctly identified its manufacturer, but underestimated its reach and numbers. Their estimates, no more than 300 operational, were already obsolete. American factories at Inglewood and Dallas were turning out more than 300 Mustangs each month. Reports highlighted its laminar-flow wings, external drop tanks, and low-drag radiator, but few German officers believed such range was sustainable in combat. The Luftwaffe's faith in technical parity lingered even as its bases emptied of fuel and pilots. General Adolf Galland warned that this new enemy erased the line between offensive and defensive air war. Yet, his proposals for countermeasures clashed with reality. The jet-powered Me-262 consumed attention and resources, while aviation gasoline was rationed so tightly that training flights were canceled outright. In combat diaries, fighter leaders described the spreading despair. "It waits for us above the clouds," one pilot wrote in May, "even over Berlin." Every interception now began with a duel against the Mustangs, and often ended there. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe's daylight defense network was fracturing under relentless pressure. While German analysts still debated production numbers, the P-51's shadow lengthened over Leipzig, Dresden, and far to the southeast, guarding bombers over Romania and Austria. The war for Europe's skies had shifted irrevocably from guessing what the Mustang was to surviving wherever it appeared. While the Luftwaffe struggled to decipher the Mustang's secret, the true power behind it was not hidden in blueprints. It was in production lines that never slept. Across the United States, the arsenal of democracy was in full motion. Between 1943 and 1945, more than 15,000 Mustangs emerged from the vast assembly halls of North American Aviation's Inglewood, California, and Dallas, Texas plants. In these factories, the clatter of rivet guns and the hiss of pneumatic drills echoed day and night. Workers, many of them women, moved with mechanical rhythm, turning out airframes faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. Each P-51 required barely 10,000 man-hours to build, half the time it took to produce a single B-17 bomber. The definitive P-51D soon dominated the lines, its clear bubble canopy granting pilots a full 360-degree view, and its Packard-built Merlin V1657 engine, an American-built version of Britain's legendary power plant, delivering 1,695 horsepower. From Alabama's aluminum mills to the precision forges of New Jersey, the supply chain became a silent colossus. Even the fuel tanks told a story of innovation. Lightweight drop tanks molded from paper and resin replaced scarce metal and stretched the Mustang's range to over 1,600 miles. The aircraft's efficiency was not only aerodynamic, but industrial, a perfect embodiment of the war machine America had become. Training bases in both the United States and England, such as Duxford, Leiston, and Bodney, graduated hundreds of pilots each month. By the summer of 1944, the 8th Air Force could send more than 1,000 Mustangs into the air at once, each armed, fueled, and ready to strike anywhere in the Reich. Meanwhile, German production lines faltered under relentless bombing. Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf facilities stood in ruins. For every fighter the Luftwaffe built, America produced 10. The Mustang was no longer just an aircraft. It was a statement. Every silver fuselage that crossed the channel carried not only guns and fuel, but proof that Allied industry had achieved total mastery. Against that momentum, even the courage of German pilots could no longer change the outcome. By mid-1944, the Mustang's silver wings reached far beyond the skies of Northern Europe. What began as a desperate escort mission over Germany had evolved into a continent-wide web of Allied air power. The P-51 now flew in every theater where bombers risked venturing, across France, Poland, the Balkans, and even into Soviet airspace. During Operation Frantic, Allied pilots performed a feat once thought impossible, launching from English bases, striking targets deep in Eastern Europe, then landing at Soviet fields in Ukraine before turning home through Italy. The sight of Mustangs bearing American stars on Soviet soil symbolized the growing unity of the Allies and the global reach of the war. In the Mediterranean, the 15th Air Force operated from Foggia in southern Italy, where long-range P-51Cs took on the most vital and dangerous missions of the campaign, protecting bombers attacking the Ploiești oil refineries in Romania. These were the fuel arteries of the Reich, and the Mustang's presence there proved devastating. From the Danube to the Carpathians, Luftwaffe defenders described the sensation of being hunted without refuge. Even the improved Bf-109G6s, armed with heavy 30mm Mk-108 cannons, could not climb fast enough to escape. The P-51's range allowed them to shepherd bombers across 1,400 miles of sky, Foggia to Vienna and back, a feat that redefined what escort meant in strategic warfare. The A effect rippled far beyond the battlefield. German aviation fuel reserves plummeted as Ploiecht burned, and flight training hours for new Luftwaffe pilots were slashed from 240 to barely 110. Many recruits went into combat barely familiar with their aircraft. By the time Allied bombers swept over Normandy in June and the Seine in July, the Mustang had done more than protect. It had made sustained daylight bombing across the continent possible. As August 1944 arrived, Allied air superiority was absolute. The Mustang's mission was no longer just defense, it was pursuit, chasing the Luftwaffe's remnants over a collapsing Reich. By the summer of 1944, the war in the air had become as much psychological as physical. The Mustang did not just dominate the skies, it reshaped the emotions of those who looked up at it. For Allied bomber crews, the first glint of silver wings sliding into formation above the stream meant survival. Crews of the 91st Bomb Group called them Angels, watching as the Mustangs darted out to scatter interceptors before they could close. A mission that once meant certain death now carried a measure of hope. The bombers' intercom chatter changed from fatal silence to cautious optimism. The little friends were here. For the Luftwaffe, the effect was opposite and devastating. The veterans of Jagdgeschwader 26 and 54, once confident Experten who dictated the pace of combat, now spoke of exhaustion and inevitability. One German ace later admitted, "They are always higher, always faster." The P-51's ability to arrive first, climb beyond interception, and attack at will stripped the defenders of initiative. Coordinated through radar vectors and tight radio discipline, the Mustangs used their range and speed to trap opponents who could neither flee nor regroup. By autumn, German intelligence estimated that more than half of all fighter losses were now caused by P-51s before they even reached the bombers. Desperation replaced doctrine. With experienced pilots dying faster than they could be replaced, the Luftwaffe filled cockpits with teenagers from home defense units, barely trained and flying outdated Bf-109s. Many never returned from their first sortie. Meanwhile, American aces like George Preddy of the 352nd Fighter Group achieved extraordinary tallies, sometimes downing 5 or 6 enemy aircraft in a single day. Each new Mustang in the sky deepened the psychological divide. To the Allies, it was deliverance. To the Germans, it was doom. By the time P-51s began strafing rail yards and troop convoys in broad daylight, the meaning was unmistakable. The war's outcome was written above in contrails. The Mustang had become more than a machine. It was the symbol of inevitability, the visible edge of Allied dominance sweeping across a dying Reich. By the closing months of 1944, the balance of air power in Europe had been completely rewritten. The Luftwaffe that had once terrorized the skies over London and Stalingrad was now a shadow of its former self. In January, Germany could still field more than 2,000 operational fighters. By November, fewer than 800 remained. The reason was not a single battle, but the unrelenting reach of the P-51 Mustang. With bombers now flying under constant escort, the U.S. 8th and 15th Air Forces struck targets deep in the Reich that had once been unreachable. Synthetic fuel plants at Leuna and Merseburg, the submarine yards at Kiel, the rail networks feeding the Ruhr. The Mustang's endurance opened new possibilities. Fighter groups no longer waited to defend the bombers. They went hunting first. These fighter sweeps, conceived by commanders like Major Hubert Zemke of the 56th Fighter Group, turned the escorts into predators. P-51s raced ahead of bomber formations, ambushing interceptors as they climbed, catching them low on fuel or half-formed in takeoff. The Luftwaffe's carefully timed intercept tactics collapsed under this new reality. Airfields that once launched Germany's defenses now burned before their planes could clear the runways. when the Ardennes offensive erupted in December 1944, the last desperate counterstroke of the Reich. The Mustangs shifted from escort to executioner. They scoured the snowy forests of Belgium, strafing convoys, locomotives, and tank columns jammed on narrow roads. The smoke from burning armor rose like dark banners over the white landscape. General Adolf Galland later confessed, "We lost control of the air long before the ground offensive began." For the Allies, total air superiority meant the invasion's success was inevitable. But among Mustang pilots, triumph carried its own gravity. Each victory came with the knowledge that the Luftwaffe they destroyed had once been the finest air force on Earth. The P-51 had not just conquered the air, it had transformed the very logic of war. From now on, victory meant denying the enemy the sky itself, and with it, the will to fight. For all its legend, the Mustang was never invincible. Beneath the gleaming aluminum skin lay vulnerabilities that every pilot understood too well. The Merlin engine, magnificent in power and altitude performance, was liquid-cooled, not air-cooled like the rugged radial engines of the Thunderbolt. A single bullet through the coolant system could turn a flight over enemy territory into a desperate glide for survival. Pilots spoke of watching the temperature gauge climb toward red, knowing they had minutes before the engine seized. Early P-51Bs also revealed frustrating flaws. The Razorback canopy restricted rear visibility, and the wing-mounted 50-caliber guns sometimes jammed under sustained fire. Only with the arrival of the P-51D, with its teardrop bubble canopy and refined gun mounts, did the Mustang reach its mature form. Yet even perfection on paper met the limits of human endurance. Long-range escort missions could last 8 hours or more. Hours spent alone over hostile territory, nursing fuel, scanning for ambushes. Fatigue blurred the line between precision and peril. A moment's misjudgment in throttle control or mixture settings could mean running dry over the North Sea. Many pilots returned more exhausted than elated, their nerves frayed by the silent hours between combat bursts. Late in 1944, new German weapons appeared, the jet-powered Me-262 and the rocket-driven Me-163 Comet. For a brief moment, they seemed to promise a reversal of fortune, but their engines flamed out, their endurance was measured in minutes, and their airfields were bombed before they could matter. The Mustang adapted again, improving fuel mixtures, refining gun harmonization, and developing energy tactics to meet jets head-on. The P-51's greatness lay not in flawlessness, but in resilience. Its weaknesses forced innovation. Its strengths multiplied under teamwork and logistics. From those lessons came the foundations of post-war air doctrine: endurance, coordination, adaptability. The Mustang was not perfect, but it was enough. It had carried the Allies to the edge of victory, and it would stay there until the end. By the opening months of 1945, the skies over Europe belonged entirely to the Mustang. What had begun as a desperate gamble for long-range escort had become the symbol of total Allied dominance. From the gray ruins of Hamburg to the smoking craters of Dresden, P-51s roamed the air unchallenged. Their missions no longer ended when the bombers turned home. They descended through the haze to hunt the remnants of the Reich's infrastructure. Trains, truck convoys, and even horse-drawn artillery became targets. The thunder of Merlin engines echoed across shattered rail yards and frozen fields. Marking the end of the Luftwaffe's once proud empire, April 7, 1945, brought the last spasm of German resistance in the air. In an act of desperation, the Luftwaffe launched Sonderkommando Elbe, a suicide ramming attack by young, barely trained pilots ordered to crash their fighters into American bombers. 183 aircraft rose into the spring sky. Most never reached their targets. P-51 squadrons intercepted them west of the Elbe and tore the formation apart before it could strike. By evening, only a handful returned. It was the Luftwaffe's final major operation, and its failure marked the death of organized German air power. As Allied armies surged eastward, the Mustangs swept ahead of them, strafing roads and columns fleeing toward Berlin. The once crowded skies were eerily empty, no contrails of interception, no answering gunfire. Over the burning capital, American and British pilots found nothing left to fight. "We flew over Berlin," one recalled, "and there was no one there." When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the Luftwaffe was a memory. Thousands of captured pilots spoke bitterly and with awe of der Mustang, the hunter that had stalked them from Normandy to the Oder. In barely 2 years, the balance of the air war had inverted completely. The hunter had become the hunted, and under the shadow of the Mustang's wings, the Reich finally fell silent. When the thunder of war finally faded, one machine still dominated the imagination of soldiers and engineers alike, the P-51 Mustang. It was not simply a weapon of victory, but a blueprint for the future. In its clean lines and laminar-flow wings lay the aerodynamic lessons that would shape the jet age. American and British engineers studying captured Mustangs after 1945 found that its balance of lift, drag, and fuel efficiency could be directly translated into swept-wing jet designs. The North American F-86 Sabre, the first great transonic fighter, owed much of its ancestry to the Mustang's principles of efficiency and control. Many Mustangs themselves found new lives after the war. They served in the air forces of more than 20 nations, from Sweden and the Netherlands to Japan and Israel. In Korea, only a few years after peace had been declared in Europe, P-51Ds once again took to the sky, this time facing MiG-15 jets streaking across the Yalu. Though slower, the Mustang's long range and rugged versatility made it indispensable for ground attack and close support, proving that endurance and adaptability could still triumph in the jet era's dawn. The legacy extended far beyond engineering. The Mustang had demonstrated that technology, production, and alliance could fuse into strategic power. It embodied the industrial coordination that turned distant ideas into mass-produced reality. And it proved that cooperation, American manufacturing paired with British innovation, could change the course of history. For German pilots who survived, the name Mustang carried both hatred and respect. For the Allies, it symbolized progress born from necessity. In the calm skies of 1946, as jet engines began to scream where propellers once sang, the Mustang remained the bridge between eras, a reminder that mastery of the air began not with speed alone, but with imagination, endurance, and the will to reach farther than anyone thought possible. Spring, 1945. Across the grass fields of East Anglia, rows of P-51 Mustangs stood motionless beneath a pale, forgiving sky. Their canopies were open, the scent of oil and spring rain mingling in the cool air. A few months earlier, these same aircraft had torn through flak and fire over the heart of Germany. Now they waited in silence, their work complete. Pilots walked among them without the tension that had once ruled their mornings. They looked east, toward the ruins of Berlin, once the symbol of invincibility, now a scar on the horizon. The journey from that first bewildered encounter over Bremen to the empty skies above the Elbe had been a long road not just of conquest, but of transformation. The Mustang had become more than a machine. It was the embodiment of reach, of endurance, of the unrelenting belief that no enemy lay beyond the horizon. For the Germans, it arrived as a phantom of inevitability. For the Allies, it became proof that courage joined with ingenuity could turn the tide of history. As ground crews drained the fuel and engines cooled for the final time, only the wind moved among the wings. The echo of the Mustang's roar, the sound that once rolled across Berlin's burning rooftops, faded into memory. Yet that echo would endure, remembered as the sound of freedom arriving on the wind, the final note of a war that had ended beneath the wings of the P-51.